Welcome aboard Candid Cockpit. This is the podcast that puts you at the pointy end of the airplane with two veteran airline captains. We'll offer insight into the pilot brain, have some fun, and promise not to get too techy. Each weekly episode has a segment that provides inside information on what's really going on behind the cockpit door, and we'll discuss some industry current topics that might affect your travels. Your two pilots and co-hosts are Les Aben and Mike Strauss. Les has over 4 decades and over 25,000 hours of experience flying airplanes. The Boeing 727, 757, 767, and the 777 were all part of Les's repertoire before he retired. He was also a check airman. Additionally, Les still has the good fortune to be a 21-year contributing editor for Flying Magazine. He has been an on-air analyst and op-ed contributor for CNN, in addition to MSNBC and NBC, among others. And finally, Les is the author of Paper Wings, a mystery suspense whodunit thriller. Mike is a current A320 captain and check airman for a major airline with over 17,000 hours of flight time. In addition to his airline experience, Mike has a diverse general aviation background as an airplane salesman and a corporate pilot flying celebrities and VIPs. If you haven't done so already, please listen to the Welcome Aboard introductory episode. Don't get on an airplane until you've listened to Candid Cockpit.
So welcome, everybody, to this week's episode of Candid Cockpit. The first part of our segment is the takeoff segment, and we're going to discuss the 737 MAX. Is it a safe airplane now?
Well, the quick answer is yes.
Quick answer is yes.
For the cruise segment, tilt your seat back and prepare for a fun discussion on pilot background experience. And by fun, well, leave that open to you. Military or civilian, or both? Who are the better pilots?
We'll have some fun with that one.
Yeah, we will.
And then finally on the landing segments, it might sound a little dry, but we're going to liven it up a little bit. We're going to talk about the training and currency requirements. The pilot that takes you to Disney World has to be proficient and current, both by the airline rules and by the FAA rules.
Yeah,
so we'll talk a little bit about that.
Not like you go out and drive once every 6 months or something. You've got to be in the airplane a lot to stay that way, stay current.
Exactly.
So people feel safe. All right, before we get going, first we have a big favor to ask. Invite all your friends to Candid Cockpit, have them take a listen, come up with some questions, and ask us.
And the other part of that is send us an email. Send it to candidcockpit.com, and we will mention your name on air with your permission. And what we'd like you to do when you send us that email is, if you've got a topic that you'd like to have discussed, then we'll consider
do our best to address it.
Yeah,
absolutely. Also, say hi to your pilots. Next time you get on an airplane, say hello to them. Let them know that you listen to Candid Cockpit, and maybe they might have some insight that might be a question that we haven't answered yet.
They'll probably ask, like, what is Candid Cockpit? Which is good. So
No, because then they'll want to listen to it.
They'll want to listen.
Yeah.
So let's move on to our takeoff segment. And on this one, we want to discuss the 737 MAX. Is this now a safe airplane? And I guess what we need to do, Mike, is probably go back and discuss sort of the history, just the brief history of what this was all about. So in 2019, Lion Air had an accident, unfortunately, that lost a lot of people. And then 5 months later, Ethiopia lost in a total of 346 people. Terrible, terrible tragedy.
It was indeed.
And the reason was attributed to a multitude of problems. And the problem stems to what was heard on the news numerous times, was the MCAS system, the Maneuvering Characteristic Augmentation System.
Correct.
What is that system? Well, this 737 has been stretched so many times that it's basically become a new airplane.
But they've kept on the same type certificate to prevent having to create a new airplane,
Right,
which becomes very, very expensive.
And a type certificate is something that has to be on a pilot's license that allows us to fly that particular airplane.
Yeah.
So even though it can be radically different. So the issue with this particular situation was that Boeing was trying to give it the same characteristics, the same flight characteristics that was felt on flying earlier models.
Right.
So
which were much shorter, so they're going to fly differently, different wing, different center of gravity.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the purpose of it was good. However, and this was only when pilots were manually flying. However, the other purpose of this thing was, this is argued by Boeing all the time, but it was supposed to, at higher power settings but lower speeds, it potentially could stall.
Correct.
And when we talk about stalling an airplane, we don't mean about the engine.
This is the air over the wing.
Gets disturbed enough that the wing says, I'm done flying.
Yep,
And that's basically a stall. Without getting into the major techie aerodynamics about it. So at the end of the day, that's what this system did. It actually, in a sense, pushed over the nose without pilot input
to prevent that stall.
Right. And that is something that's very important. But the key here is it was never told to the pilots that this system worked. There was nothing in their manuals.
Right.
And as we know, systems malfunction. Right.
Right.
So this system was tied into an indicator that told you a stall was approaching. We call it the angle of attack indicator.
Correct.
But Boeing, most of the time, puts in duplicate systems, redundant is what we call in the business, right?
Yep.
Usually it's at least two systems
for every, or a backup system to every system.
Right. Good way of putting it. So, and sometimes they have a backup to the backup.
Correct.
In this case, they only had that one system, and that indicator that showed you were approaching a stall was tied into this MCAS system, and it basically sent out a bad signal to the airplane saying, hey, you're stalling.
So fix it.
And that's what this MCAS system did. It started pointing the nose at the ground.
Right.
So the Lion Air pilots had no idea
what was taking place.
And
they were trying to fight it. And it's tough to fight an automated aircraft system.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And Boeing's fix for the problem, or Band-Aid, I should say, is that what happened was that they said, refer to a checklist we've had since forever, which was called the runaway trim check. Now, I've done that checklist.
Right.
We talked about my 727 Jurassic Jet days, and that had a very similar trim system where there's a wheel on either side of the pedestal in the cockpit.
Explain trim a little bit.
Yeah, sure. So trim is it basically neutralizes the control forces that the airplane is presented to the pilot. So in other words, if the airplane is showing pilot feels like it needs to go up, the pilot's going to want to push down on the control wheel.
Correct.
Well, the trim takes out that pressure.
Right. Actually, a little bit like a boat, like an outboard motor in a boat. Trimming up the motor of a boat.
For our boaters out there, that they would understand. Very, very, very similar to that. So that old procedure was supposed to take the place of the failure of the system, and you literally have to go and grab that trim wheel, which is spinning rather rapidly to stop it.
Right.
And then you have to disconnect the system that makes that wheel spin with some cutout switches. It's complicated. It's not complicated, but you have to. The point of that whole thing is that you have to recognize it's happening.
There's the biggest key, is recognizing what happens. And in a lot of these automated systems on aircraft, you've got very little time to figure out what's happening. And that time condenses even more so if you don't know the system is there and what it's supposed to do.
Right.
Part of our training is knowing every system in our aircraft.
Right.
But you're right, the pilots were not aware of this.
Which is a travesty I think we should discuss in a little bit. But at the end of the day, this is on a modern day aircraft now. The 727 that I flew back in the Wright brothers' age, of course. I mean, that airplane, was it made sense. That was something that potentially could happen. But on an electronic flight control airplane, not so much. No, it was none of the pilots were expecting.
No, exactly.
And they weren't very. Honestly, they didn't have a lot of experience compared to U.S. pilots.
Yeah, that's where I was going to go with that. Is the training the U.S. pilots receive is probably greater than almost any place else in the world.
Right.
And especially when you get back into some of these, for lack of a better term, third world countries, that are trying to progress in today's modern age. So their pilots are not as trained. They haven't had experience with even the older type systems, as well as the newer systems, even less.
Right, and that's not to disparage
all.
pilots from other countries. It's just that they don't have the same opportunities we've had in the U.S. Now, however, they go to places that have Boeing simulators.
Correct.
So they do get trained with more or less, maybe U.S. people, U.S. Manufactured simulators, so on and so forth. So they do get
They
similar.
get good training.
Yeah, they get good training, but the experience level for flying airplanes is not the same as the U.S.
Correct.
In any case, go ahead.
It's a shame, in every part of it, from the accident to the training, to who draws the blame for something like this too. There's no really one place to put it. It was just any accident's a chain of events. You take one link out of that chain, probably the accident didn't happen. And this is a very good example of that what could have taken place.
Right. And which bears out because 5 months later,
another one,
we had Ethiopian, and those pilots knew what the problem was with the MCAS system, and attempted to go through that old checklist that I mentioned, that runaway trim checklist, and they were unsuccessful. Now there was some things that they could have done better, but at the end of the day, they knew what was happening. They
were a step ahead of the Lion Air crew.
Not by much.
Correct, exactly.
Not by much. Yeah. So where you were going was that now we all like to put the blame on people. But, Boeing certainly failed in explaining that system to pilots, to the people that were buying the airplane. And beyond that, we also found out another chink in the armor, and that was the designee system.
Right.
So if you're familiar with it, the FAA doesn't have enough resources to check things.
Right. To personally check things. So they've got what's called a designee. Right. So they assign these tasks of checking to other people, third party, but they're usually pilots, and usually pilots in that type aircraft as well.
Right, and the best way to explain it is for what we're familiar with. In our airline, we have people that are designated check airmen.
Correct.
And they have to go through a training program, like I went through, and like what you went through, to be able to check other pilots for the airline's procedures and for the FAA procedures, and then the FAA says, all right, he's been through the training, he passed the training, we bless them, they are now our designees. Correct.
To check those that we don't have time to check.
Correct. Yeah. Now, the same situation applies to a aircraft manufacturer. They designate their employees from within the company that have been trained to design systems and oversee these kinds of things.
Systems internally, correct.
Right.
Yeah.
So, people from the outside can say things like, well, it's the fox guarding the hen house. And in a way, this situation was kind of there.
Could be construed that way.
Yeah. But this system has been in place since the 30s and has actually been very successful. And it's still in place today.
And most airlines, they want to make sure they do it right anyway, because if there is an accident in this situation, it turns out that the designee was the chain, the link in the chain that should have been removed. It looks bad upon themselves.
Right.
So they're protecting not only what their overseeing agency is protecting, but they're overseeing their own self-protection.
Right. And I think in light of that, there might have been they were advised by other by lower ranking employees that said, maybe we should bring this to somebody's attention, and it never got to the point that the attention was rightfully placed on this. So there were certainly mistakes by Boeing, but certainly the FAA's oversight wasn't all that well received either.
Yeah, it was. This was one of those rare instances where it just nothing really worked the way it should.
Right.
Yeah, which is unfortunate.
And I think we, like any accident that's caused by external forces or pilot error, whatever you want to call it, we always learn something. That's why we do accident investigations. And this had a lot of moving parts in it.
It did.
All the way to management.
Yeah.
That's what's amazing about it. So,
and it's true. We joke in the airline industry, every FAR, Federal Aviation Regulation, is written in blood.
Yeah.
And it's true. You said the investigation begets learning. And if you look at aviation safety as a whole right now in our modern day, is very, very safe. Still the safest way to travel.
We have, I mean, we should be knocking on wood, but our fatalities in aviation accidents or accidents themselves, with or without fatalities, is just almost zero here in the U.S. for U.S. carriers.
Yeah, agreed. And it is. It's the training, and the training comes from what we learn, and the training begets new learning, and the experiences and the accidents and the incidents, or even things that are caught during training.
Right.
Someone will go, oh, hey, maybe we should relook at this. You know, this is a training session that worked, or a training environment that worked, but wait a minute, we just found something that maybe we could improve upon.
Right, exactly. So this all combined into scrutinizing the 737 MAX to the point that it's probably the most scrutinized airplane in the world, and Boeing, as a manufacturer, is probably scrutinized pretty well. So, we go back to the question: is it safe to get on a 737 MAX? Well, guess what?
Yeah,
we went to Iceland
on a 737 MAX.
737 MAX. So
didn't even think twice about it.
We didn't even. So the bottom line is, Boeing has a safe airplane now. And now there are versions of the MAX. They're working on the MAX 10 to getting that certified.
Right.
There are some issues with that, but I think that's the end of stretching this thing.
Again, they're going to self-scrutinize a little bit harder than anything in the past.
And they're already delaying the certification of that airplane.
And good on them for recognizing that. No, so now all of a sudden the marketing dollar doesn't beget the revenue dollar.
Right, which is a good point to bring up, was that some of this pressure may have been because of the competition, which is Airbus, and they were trying to push this airplane out to certification maybe quicker than they should have, right?
Agreed, yeah. Against the Neo, the Airbus Neo.
Correct.
Which is what
Absolutely
I fly,
right. Yeah.
And it's got a similar system, but it's more incorporated into the aircraft and has been a part of the aircraft since the day that aircraft was certified.
Correct.
So therefore, the pilots are more familiar with it.
Yeah. And a great point, because this was a 1968 design, 69.
So think about it. If it was 68, 69 when it came into play, it started being designed in the late 50s, early 60s.
Right. And the point where I was going with this thing is this airplane has been stretched. And I'm sorry to use the pun, to the max.
Say it.
It's been stretched to the max. So I don't know how much further they can stretch this airplane to not call it something new. But in any case, get on your 737 MAX. It's safer.
And go fly. Yeah, exactly.
Go fly from the airplane. So, anything else on that?
Not on the MAX. Okay. When do we go to Iceland again?
Yeah. Well, there you go. Okay. Well, let's move on to our cruise segment.
Here we go.
So, cruise segment, we'll talk about background experience, and we've nailed it down to civilian or military pilot. Who's the better pilot?
First, do you have a can opener I can use? I'd like to open up this can of worms.
Yeah, well, we've done it.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Where do you even start with that? You go into the military. Military in itself defines rigorous training from the minute you step foot on a military training base. It's all regimented. It's all one way or no way. Civilian flying is a little bit different, but the military pilots, when they go into the military, they already know their end goal. They know exactly what's going to happen and how it's going to happen. Their training is so straight line with very little variance. Not saying that civilian training is any different, but that might be a little more lax. You might have a little bit of time in between this training event and the next training event, or even between particular ratings. Where in the military, it's very compressed and happens very fast.
It's very regimented. Yeah. And plus the fact, I mean, you're getting pilots that are flying jet airplanes with very, very low time, which is a testament to their training.
Absolutely.
Because I mean, at the flight time that I had, flying Cessna 172s and whatever small airplane, I was not flying a jet airplane. And where these folks in the military, almost start off right away, at least in a turboprop,
yeah, exactly,
high performance single engine turboprop.
Yeah, they don't jump into a 172 and go get their private and then work on their way up. It's immediately thrown into, like you said, high performance.
Yeah,
and it's one of the best anecdotes I hear in aviation is staying ahead of the airplane. And if you've got no flying experience and then you're put into an airplane that goes 200 knots, that's a pretty big leap to jump out in front of it and stay there.
And that requires some pretty serious
And
training.
again, it talks to just how good the military training is.
Yeah, it does. And so
excellence was the word I was looking for.
Right. And some of these military people are headed to fighters.
Yep.
Some of them are headed to transport type airplanes. But either way, it's that they're pretty sophisticated airplanes that they're flying. And you get the question from people. It's like, well, where'd you learn to train? Air Force
or Navy,
or something like that. Yeah. So we're civilians, but they a lot of the fighter pilots, as skilled as they are in their job description per se, and how they got there. I mean, they really have to pat themselves on the back for getting there. But they're flying an airplane that, for the most part, has about maybe 2 hours worth of fuel. Right. And they have a very, as they call them, sorties. Their missions are very specific in what they do, and they train really hard. For those kind of things.
And they're doing it by themselves. They've got no help whatsoever.
And
in the aircraft.
Which brings us to, is that a problem when you bring them to an airline cockpit? Because now you've got to deal with the crew
resource management,
right?
Just the crew environment.
Concept. Yes.
Yeah.
Right. So it's an adjustment.
It is certainly an adjustment. And I've flown one of my good friends at my airline. I picked him out at the interview class, the interview date. I picked him out as a military single fighter pilot, and come to find out he was exactly that. And when we got in training, I said to him, how difficult is this to get into going from single pilot for 26 years that you did to a crew environment? And he goes, quote, "I'm the dumb, slow kid in class." Now, he was probably one of the smartest guys I'd met in that class, but now it's like starting over his training.
Yeah.
New airplane, new way to fly that airplane. But this is where civilian training now comes into play, because all of the airlines are civilian trained, and they're training these military guys that were flying single pilot, or even the transport guys, because it's still a new environment. And that speaks to the quality and excellence of the civilian training. So
True.
It's fairly equal, military and civilian. It's just different.
It's different. And one example I could give you is, I flew with a co-pilot. He's a Marine, so there's an issue there right away, right? Sorry, Marines. But he was the first to be self-defecating, and he was having problems with reading what we call Jeppesen charts.
Oh, charts, right.
Charts, that was not part of his repertoire.
Right.
And in any case, he was looking at these things and having problems, even though he had got it through our training to some extent. But as a civilian, we know how to read them. And what are we talking about? The charts we're talking about is specific to landing at a specific
airport-specific charts,
which requires
and for a better
procedure.
word for our non-flying public, maps.
Maps. But it's a map that maps out the approach to that airport.
Dedicated to that particular airport approach. arrivals, departures, the airport diagram itself, very detailed.
But it was just a small facet of some of the things he hadn't been exposed to in the military. But listen, he had this Marine he flew F-18s, So he was adjusting, as we just spoke about, to the crew environment and so on and so forth. But he was hired because of what the airlines know about the regimented training.
Absolutely,
what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Civilian, on the other hand, goes through. We've talked about this in a prior episode about us, starting on the Cessna 172 level and working our way out. I was a flight instructor.
Right.
You did airplane demo as a salesman.
Yeah, airplane demo and then into corporate jets.
Right. And we built up our experience level in that direction. For me, I ended up going to a regional carrier, what was called Commuters at the time. And that was sometimes flying through around the same thunderstorm cell and the same weather.
Right.
I was used to go from Philadelphia to Trenton, New Jersey. And weather doesn't move all that, yeah.
They're about that close.
They're about that close. In a 19-passenger turboprop airplane called the Twin Otter. And back and forth. And, we were in and out of weather that whole trip. And basically the same weather system.
Right.
So whereas a F-16 pilot or an F-18 pilot does a quick sortie, and the kind of sorties they do generally are not in instrument weather.
No.
So then again, they don't get that kind of exposure.
Yeah, it is very different, but it's amazing how well prepared they come.
Yeah,
and
they adapt.
Yeah, well, they're prepared, but then they adapt quickly.
Yeah.
And as you said, what helps that is your buddy in the F-18 driver, the Marine, he came to it in a humble way, which will allow a greater open-mindedness, if you will,
right,
to soak in the new things they have to learn.
Right.
And the civilian side nowadays, you used to be able to just go. I was talking to a young lady just the other day about this, and her question was, do I just find a flight instructor and learn how to fly? Maybe when we started flying, perhaps, but now a lot of these flight schools are set up academy style. So it's kind of a precursor to the airlines or to some regimented type of flying, whether it's airline, whether it's charter, whether it's cargo. So now I think today's pilots are able to gather more and better experience in a shorter amount of time to do the kind of flying that we do.
Right, and it's very airline oriented if that's the progression that you want to take.
Exactly.
There's still flight instruction out there for people to just go enjoy themselves.
I just want to go up and fly a Cub. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's still out there.
Absolutely.
So, but that being said, and we're leaving out the Navy pilots, even the Army pilots, that we call them rotor heads, right? Because exactly. But most of the, since we're on that subject of Army, they actually do fly some fixed-wing aircraft, and mostly it's for logistics, right? Mm-hmm. For transporting generals and so on and so forth. Yeah. So they do get in a fixed wing. We kid them about, just flying helicopters, but
we're just jealous because they can actually fly helicopters and we cannot.
Yeah. Well, so anyhow, and then the Navy folks, they also, they fly transport category airplanes, some pretty sophisticated ones. Notwithstanding the fact that you've got that they fly off of a postage stamp in the middle of the ocean. That's pretty impressive.
That is very impressive. You can joke about that all you want, but could you or I go out and do that? Not likely.
No.
Your airplane was bigger than a postage stamp in itself.
Yeah, the 777. Yeah. Well, anyhow, they're talented in a lot of different ways, and I think where we're going with this is that I don't think either one is better.
Nope. They both routes make great pilots. Yeah. Just in different ways.
Right.
But there's no I'm better than you better.
No. But the interesting thing is that when we both went to basic indoctrination classes when we started with the airline and we met our classmates, and I was one of the 2 civilians out of 6 classmates that was there, and most of the military folks had around 2,000 hours.
Right. Military time counts their time differently than civilian time.
That's also true.
Yes.
But where I was kind of going in a general term is they're 2,000, and I was more than double their time as a civilian. And I also had, I was fortunate to get time in airliner-rated things like related to 727. I had time in 2 seats on the airplane, even before I got to my airline. But that's not untypical.
No, not at all.
So, because remember what we just talked about, the fighter guys and gals, they also, their missions are very short.
Yeah.
Because they don't have big fuel tanks.
No, they don't.
Yeah.
Lucky them, kind of.
Yeah. Anything else?
No, we can't answer the question.
Okay.
That's the bottom line. We cannot answer that question.
We can't answer that question. So whoever you got up front is a qualified and experienced pilot, whether they come from the military.
Exactly.
End of story. Yeah.
Be confident in their skills.
Very good.
Well, once again, we have another favor to ask. We're going to ask this every episode. Invite your friends to listen to us, Candid Cockpit Podcast. We want to hear from you.
And in that regard, send us an email. If you got a topic that has been a burning question in your head about what we do behind that cockpit door or what's going on in anything related to airline, send it to candidcockpit.com. And if you'd like, give us your permission and we'll mention your name on the air.
Absolutely. And finally, say hi to your pilots. Tell them you listen to us. See what kind of response you get. And they may ask, how do I find you? Tell them. Tell them how you found us.
Just ask the flight attendant that's standing at the boarding door and just peek your head in the door and say hi. I just wanted to look around and
rarely will a crew say no.
Rarely will they. Yeah. Unless they're terribly busy. So
or eating lunch. Here's a great topic people are always asking about currency, training and pilot currency requirements. What's required, A, to go fly the jet, and B, to continue to fly the jet?
Right.
Not like driving your car.
No.
Not at all.
No. So basically, here's a simple one that we all know and love, and I have to do it as a retiree and flying my own airplane, is that every 90 days I've got to make 3 takeoffs and landings.
Right. Yeah.
Same with the
jet.
Yeah.
We're required to do the same thing. How we got to that point is when you get hired at an airline or even within that airline when you're going to go fly a new jet. Each new jet requires an entire different training on that particular aircraft. It's called a type certificate. That's what we call it. And it usually involves about 3 to 4 weeks of training, systems, operations, and then actual training in the simulator. And all of that is done typically before you even get to the airplane or touch the airplane. The standing joke is, I learned how to fly this airplane. I got a type certificate on this aircraft. I don't know how to open the door.
Right. and even... Yeah, it's kind of sad because a lot of times, almost all the time, the transition is you do your training, you get your check ride,
correct,
right, and then you're scheduled to do what we call is IOE,
right, initial operating experience. So
you get out to the line, and your first landing is with passengers with a revenue flight. Yeah. So. That's not necessarily currency, but that's how the progress of things
to get there.
And
then from there, we go to what you were saying about your personal aircraft is every 90 days, we have to have at least 3 takeoff and landing.
Right.
A little bit further, because we're also always flying on an IFR flight plan, we also need 3 approaches. 6 approaches.
6 approaches. 6 approaches within 6 months.
6 months.
Yeah, exactly.
Can't forget that part of it too, and that's important. I mean,
an IFR flight plan for our listeners is instrument flight rules.
Right.
So it's in the flying in weather and clouds. Reference to the instruments.
Allowing you to fly an instrument or in clouds and weather, where not necessarily you can be in pure daylight conditions, but you're still on what's called an IFR flight plan.
Correct. Right.
And what that does is it basically keeps air traffic control doing just that, controlling you and telling you where to go, how to go, and when to go.
And they're spacing us in between other airplanes.
Exactly. Keeping us, how should I put it, separation. Separation is the ATC word. Right. They like keeping you separated from other aircraft, terrain, obstacles, and not necessarily weather, but they can help a lot in separating you from weather, thunderstorms, such like that. They can tell you, hey, well, you've got weather at 12 o'clock and 50 miles, 30-mile radius, and
it's a different responsibility. In other words, when you the difference between instrument flight rules, IFR, and VFR, visual flight rules, is that the pilot under visual flight rules is responsible for their own separation.
Takes on all those separation issues.
Where the controller is the one responsible
on
for
an
that,
IFR.
with your compliance.
Correct.
As the pilot, of course.
Right.
So,
now back up from that rabbit hole.
right. right.
You learned in the simulator. You got to the airplane. Now you're flying the airplane. 90 days comes up and you're looking at your logbook. Do I have my 3 landings? Yes. Then I can continue flying that aircraft.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And then that brings us off a little bit on a tangent from the standpoint of my airline in particular flew a lot of long-haul routes, and we had to take a third pilot, which is a relief pilot, right? And that relief pilot generally would fly during the cruise segment, maybe the descent segment does, depending upon what the needs are of the captain and the rest of the crew. But most of the time, they weren't landing the aircraft,
right.
And we just talked about that currency requirement, right? So they very often will run out of that if they stay as relief pilots, trip after trip.
Right.
So they very often will stay out of that realm of currency. So what do? Well, they're required to go down and do takeoffs and landings, but really what it is a mini check ride.
Right.
And so they go
in
through
the simulator. This is all in the simulator.
Correct. It's in the simulator, and they hit the reset button and they start their 90-day period all over again. So there's a lot involved with just rather than just turning the key to the airplane and starting it up.
Boeing's got a key
to the door.
I don't have a key.
You don't have a key. Okay. Actually, there's a pad, electronic pad.
We have
now.
a keypad.
Yeah. So, anyhow, anything more on that one?
No, we were going to talk about. Well, we talked a little bit about approaches. There's different categories of approaches. ILS, instrument landing system, which is the most common to get you into an airport through some weather. Southern California is a great example. May, June, gloom. Somewhat low overcast layer. You've got to fly through it almost always to get to a coastal airport. And it's a system that will bring you right through the clouds, right to the airport, and there it is right in front of you. There's different levels of that. And one of those levels requires an auto landing. Goes back to one of our previous segments of landing.
Right.
And that, again, brings its own type of currency.
Correct. Yeah. Matter of fact, every time you go down to recurrent training, at least from my airline, you were required to perform what they call the Category 3 landing, which is an auto land situation. And there is a lot of procedural things involved. It's not just sitting there with your hands folded and watching the airplane do its thing.
Right.
There's a lot of decision points if things aren't going right that you have to take over.
You have to take over the aircraft and fly away to some other airport.
Yeah.
Or try again.
But
yeah, exactly. Yeah. So there's all sorts of currency. And then, well, we could go down another rabbit hole about medical currencies, but I think we address that in another episode.
We do.
So rest assured that your pilot is rested and current in that aircraft that he's flying you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. Very good.
Anything else, Les?
Well, we were talking. Did you have any training stories that you want to scare people with?
None that I care to share.
No.
I have successfully passed every training event. Knock on wood. I have recurrent next month.
And you know what? It's good for you. And I had that after 34 years. I was happy to say it. There were some check rides that I wasn't happy with my performance.
We are our own worst critic.
Yeah. But for the most part, my last days on the 727, I had a crew that I knew, at least the flight engineer, and it was my last check ride on it because I was transitioning to the 767. But the fun part of it was that we were going through the standard checklist procedures of emergencies and so on and so forth. And I think we had a hydraulic problem, and the flight engine. This is in the simulator, and I called for a particular checklist. And the engineer, we used to have a book as opposed to an iPad now, right? And it was a huge, heavy book. And he I called for the procedure, and he was always spot on. Check ride was going just very smooth. And he couldn't find the checklist, and laughing broke out, you know, and we're still trying to do this procedure, and the check airman knew we were doing very well, and I felt that we were doing very well. So he cut us some slack, and finally, you know, he opened up the checklist procedure, and we went through the whole process, and you know, got the simulator on the ground very safely. But it was a fun. We know how stressed out we get about training situations, and it was nice to leave that airplane
feeling better, feeling good about it.
Feeling good.
Yeah, you know, and I think I've found that in a lot of our training sessions, you know, they're throwing things at you that you only typically and hopefully only see in the simulator.
Right.
And the instructor has his duty to stay on you to make sure you handle it right. But he also is there to help you understand better of what and why you're doing it. And therefore, there's a little bit of, how shall I say, latitude to accomplish that task.
You do have to perform it to a standard.
Correct.
And really, I mean, your job can be in jeopardy if you don't. If you don't. There's some protocols if there's a failure. It's never the whole check ride. There's portions of it, and you do have the opportunity to go back. But it's still, you know, whenever you go down for recurrent, your job potentially is in jeopardy.
And you think that every time you get into the simulator.
I know.
Yeah, I don't know why, because we know that
we've done it before. We're
probably going to do it again. And the instructor is there to help get you through that, and not necessarily guide you through it, but help point you in the right direction.
Right.
And then it's up to you to find the finish line.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Well, which is a safe flight.
It is.
Preferably, no matter what emergency you have in the sim. Yeah.
Don't crash a sim and you're good.
Yeah. Okay.
That's all I've got, Les.
Okay. That's all I got. Well, Captain Mike, it seems like we've landed this episode.
Ironically, after talking about landings.
Yeah, that's true. So we're parked, and I hope our listeners gain some insight into our pilot brains, as scary as that may sound.
I was a little nervous. Good thing there's not little cameras inside.
So next week, we're going to discuss some pertinent details that a lot of people probably weren't aware of about pilot license and why that's important. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but there's some aspects about pilot licenses and ratings, and we kind of touched on it that people don't think about.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. Yeah. Well, as we begin our parking checklist, just want to ask our listeners one more time, get on the PA, spread the word about our podcast. Tell your friends and family, candidcockpit.com. If you've got a topic that you'd like us to discuss, please ask us, candidcockpit.com. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Send pictures.
Yeah.
Okay. Thanks for listening.
Hey, thanks for listening, everybody.
All right.